There we go. Perfect.
There's the voice.
What I'll do is I'm going to do Culture Central updates after we've heard from Robin, if that's all right, because I know some people sort of tend to kind of have to leave around 10 o'clock. So we'll do CC updates after that. So Robin, I'm going to hand straight over to you, if that's all right. So this kind of basically, general election, local politics, off we go.
Great. Well, let's dive in then. So yes, hello. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. I am Robin Cantrill-Fenwick. I'm the chief exec of a consultancy called Baker Richards. Just for anybody who doesn't know us, I'll do the 20-second intro. We're a consultancy that believes that a solid financial footing is what makes creative and social impact possible, while unstable finances jeopardize everything. So we equip cultural organizations and visitor attractions for an ambitious and resilient future by providing all of these things: pricing, consulting, segmentation, primary research, dashboarding, strategy, and today, political chat. So what qualifies me to kick off our conversation? Well, here's me 20-something years ago running for election in the city of Bath, unsuccessfully. But I have pounded pavements. I've spent many years knocking on doors, delivering leaflets. I know what it is to ask people for their vote. And I then went off to sort of work in Lib Dem parliamentary, Lib Dem HQ in Westminster around 2005, and then in and around Parliament for a number of years, both for the Lib Dem party and doing lobbying for everything from a university to accountancy to climate science. I did a bit of research assistanting in the House of Lords. Some of these photos, I got Gordon Brown's first speech as Prime Minister to be delivered at my workplace, the University of Westminster. Earlier this year, there was me looking very overweight, giving evidence to the Justice Select Committee. But the three pictures on the right are from the Mercury Theatre in Colchester, showing a minister, a Select Committee chair, the then ACE chairman, all supporting our work. And then continuing the all-white, all-male theme on this slide, we have the Mercury's first election hustings in 2015 that are now a regular event and part of the democratic fabric of that town. And to be honest, I'm weirdly proud of that. And I really recommend that cultural organisations do consider, if they've got an auditorium in particular, providing a space for hustings. These days, you will most often see me on election nights hanging around a sports hall at 3 o'clock in the morning. There is no place I would rather be. I put in shifts for the BBC's election results service that feeds all the news and results from the election counts back to the BBC's website and broadcasts. Many of you on the call will know Sarah G, and Sarah G is also a BBC election results stringer. So I've seen politics close up. I'm somewhat immersed in it, but I'm definitely no academic. And I'm really keen to start this conversation and then be quiet and hear from all of you. So Baker Richards undertook some research for Arts Professional earlier this year, and we asked people, how likely is it that you or the organisation that you work for will see reduced funding due to local authority cuts in the foreseeable future? And taken together, those who have already lost, are very likely to lose, or quite likely to lose funding, accounted for 77% of the respondents. So I'm very, very conscious that I'm talking to a West Midlands audience. Many of you will have been affected by significant cuts to local government already. You'll appreciate that parties of all colours are making swinging local government cuts. And when it comes to them, culture tends to come out of it pretty badly. Local government, we know, is being reduced to spending on statutory funded services. And we're going to see another huge round of local authority cuts at the end of this year, start of the next year, in the next budget cycle. And I think people will be looking nationwide to examples like Culture Central in terms of how they kind of frame their response. They'll be looking to the experience that Birmingham has had. But without getting off on too gloomy a start, I think that local authorities are really the early warning sign, the canary in the coal mine for the direction of travel for national funding, because the pressures and the market forces are very much the same. So we have an aging population and a declining birth rate that affects both the tax base and the proportion of tax that needs to be spent on health and care. We've no longer got access to supranational funds, things like Creative Europe from the EU. There's a resistance to tax increases. That's pretty much the story of this week. We've got flat economic growth and high national debt. And all of these pressures are bearing down on public funding across the board. And so that means that statutory services are more likely to be protected. So whoever wins, the trend appears to be heading away from regular grant funding for arts and culture over time. I think we're going to see philanthropy, earned income, commercialization, one-off grants, special schemes, capital grants, tax relief, seed funding, things like that, as being more of a part of our long-term financial future. slightly facetious question, but where is the worst place to judge the strength, the speed, and the direction of a hurricane? Well, the center. Anywhere close to it gets pretty messy too, but it's absolutely the same with elections. So we're in it now, and it's very, very hard to be objective. But I think it is important to sort of start with some of the politics before we get to policy. Not everyone follows every twist and turn of a campaign. So, here we are, perhaps hoping to have a national conversation about what sort of health service we'll have in the future. How do we fix the crisis in childcare? Will we be protected from AI taking our creative output and reusing it to then take our jobs? What's the future for arts education? Is what I just said about public funding for culture true? And often we'll talk instead about Rishi's latest calamity, or Penny Mordaunt's hair, or whatever the hell Ed Davey is doing today, or the fridge on Angela Rayner's battle bus. Election campaigns have been shown over and over again to be a really terrible way of answering the question, who should run the country? And it's really worth remembering, when the dust settles, that most election campaigns can be summed up in just one or two things. So these are all the elections that I was old enough to remember in my lifetime. I won't read through them all, but I have highlighted two campaigns. So in 2010, the Clegg mania moment from the debates, it's well documented that made the difference between Nick Clegg being offered the role of Deputy Prime Minister rather than Secretary of State for Education. And then in 2017, Theresa May's nothing has changed moment, her social care funding plan, really suppressed the older Conservative vote. They stayed at home. And as a consequence, Theresa May lost her majority and we got a hung parliament. On balance, though, when you look at pretty much all the other elections, the result that came out was the result that was expected when we went in. And so it is possible that this 6 weeks that we're currently sitting through right now may actually change very little. So rather than be buffeted by the kind of day-to-day headlines of the campaign, let's just step back, look at the big picture. So starting with uniform national swing, the swingometer that we will see on election night. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the swings involved when the party of power has changed. So in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, with a 5.3% swing from Labour to Conservative, took over from Jim Callaghan. She had a majority of 44 that she built up from there. In 2010, with a 5.1% swing, David Cameron took over with no majority at all. It was a hung parliament and he needed a coalition. 1997, the Labour landslide, Tony Blair achieved a 10.2% swing from the Tories. He got a majority of 179. We go back to 1945, Clem Attlee, with an 11.8% swing, took over from Churchill after the war, a majority of 145. When you look at all of those, the scale of Labour's challenge becomes clear, because they went into the last parliament so far behind in terms of seats. So a swing of 13.8%, more than Tony Blair or Clem Attlee achieved, delivers Labour a majority of 30. A swing of 12.7%, still outperforming Blair and Attlee, delivers an outright majority of 1. The real barrier is lower, though, at 8.2%. Labour become the single biggest party in the Commons, so the expectation there would be they'd lead a minority government or a coalition. And it takes a swing of 4.7% for the Tories to lose their majority, though at that point they'd still be the single biggest party. So let's have a look at what has actually been happening in the polls then over a long period of time. So here we're looking at average voting intention across multiple posters since 2020. So along the bottom here, we've got 2020 through to 2024. And you can see that Labour's lead has been solidifying since 2022. You can also see that Reform is rising fast, but the shaded period here reflects the campaign that we're in now, the actual election. So statistically, there's probably only so far that Reform can rise in the next few weeks. Labour have been polling at around 20 points ahead of the Tories since last year. That lead feels really baked in. But there are, though, two interesting, really sharp changes in the data. So the first is the government's COVID bounce back in 2020. Big surge in support for the Conservatives at the cost of Labour and Reform, all around furlough. But it was very short-lived. You then have the Truss government that simultaneously peeled off a load of moderate Conservatives and switched them to Labour. So you see Labour's line shoot up as the Conservatives' line correspondingly drops. And hard-right Conservatives switch to Reform. So you see Reform get a bit of a bump there around that time as well. And those changes have stayed much more baked in over time. But what both of those lines, both of those events show us is there are big, big changes that can happen in a very short period of time. Lots of votes in the centre are soft. They're not hard Labour. They're not die-hard Tory. They're able to switch around depending on the prevailing media narrative. And that is what makes elections so exciting. Anything can happen. A couple of things to note. Often by now in an election, we would see the polls narrowing so that the media can report that it's a tight race and it's all getting terribly exciting. Absolutely no sign of that happening at the moment. And it's also worth noting that reform are very hard to predict. The polling methodology that big polling companies use may not capture their voters very well. That's exactly what happened in the EU referendum. So if you'll indulge me in just stating the bleeding obvious, just to set up the next little section just about reform, historically, the Conservatives have done very well because they are the only party on the right and centre right. So the progressive vote in Great Britain splits all over the place, slightly different in Northern Ireland. But if Labour win this time, it is in part because they've moved onto the centre ground. So they've peeled off centre-leaning Conservative voters. The long-term charts that we just looked at show that's true. It's in part going to be because some Tories are going to stay at home. They're fed up with their own side. But it's also because of the emergence of reform, squeezing the Tories from the right. I thought people might be flagging a bit at this point with all of the charts. So I asked an AI to create an image that ultimately turned out to be really quite disturbing. But there we go. Nigel Farage has two political superpowers that we need to acknowledge. The first is largely useless in a general election. So you might remember the old social grade classifications. We often talk about ABC ones to mean relatively affluent people. Nigel Farage is absolutely adept at getting C2s and Ds who ordinarily wouldn't vote to vote and to vote for him. Now, that really matters in a referendum where the whole country is being counted as one unit and we're all being asked one question. But if you break the country up into constituencies, this power is very often neutralised. So if Labour have got 23,000 votes in a constituency and the Conservatives have got 25,000 votes, and Nigel Farage gets 4,000 people to turn up to vote who wouldn't ordinarily vote, that, in terms of changing the result, achieves very, very little. The other political superpower that he has was explained much more clearly than I could ever manage by the polling legend Sir John Curtis on Laura Kuenssberg's programme on Sunday. So I'll just play you that.
Now, as many as 1 in 4 2019 Tory voters are saying they will back reform, up from 1 in 5 last week.
So Nigel Farage is very effective at reducing the Conservative vote in particular. So if in every constituency in the land, Farage peels off votes from the Conservatives more than anyone else, he makes it much easier for Labour to win all over the country. When the Tories were wiped out in 1997, that Blair landslide, it was estimated at the time that James Goldsmith's referendum party, very much the forerunner to reform, had cost the Tories up to 50 seats, and they peeled off just 2.5% of the vote. And Reform are polling nearer kind of 16 to 18%. So Reform could really, really affect the result. You'll know that some pollsters are now using multi-level regression and post-stratification models, MRP models, to try and predict what Labour's vote share actually means in terms of seats. MRPs work by trying to estimate the connection between characteristics like age, gender, and the area that a person lives, and which party they'll vote for. They are really, really headline grabbing, and they can be quite hit and miss. So in 2019, YouGov had an excellent MRP. They predicted the outcome of the result, the general election, really, really closely. Since then, we've had 4 MRPs covering local elections, 3 from electoral calculus that were pretty wide of the mark, and 1 from YouGov that was, again, pretty accurate. So let's look at YouGov in a bit more detail. YouGov's MRP, taken before Nigel Farage announced he was standing, shows a Labour majority of 194. They win 422 seats. Be fascinated to see another YouGov MRP now. This result requires an incredible suppression of the Conservative vote. It is not just about how many people peel off to Reform, as headline grabbing as that is. It is much more, or to Labour for that matter, it is much more about how many traditional Tory voters who've previously been very highly motivated to vote simply stay at home instead. To be honest, I will eat my hat if Labour's majority is as big as this, but given how badly the Conservative campaign is currently going, it is not 100% impossible. So let's go on to look at outcomes. Let's take a moment, based on the mathematical challenge that we've just looked at, to consider the possibility that Labour don't win and the Conservatives stay in power. So we should ask ourselves, for those on the call who may be wishing for a change of government, should we be careful what we wish for? Because it was the Conservatives that created DCMS in 1992 that put culture on the top table. It was John Major's government that created the National Lottery in 1994 that's been hugely transformative for culture. Conservatives created the Creative Industries Council in 2011. There was a load of arts funding for the Olympics and somewhat less for the Commonwealth Games. All through austerity, George Osborne protected the core funding for national arts and culture, and ACE in particular, and in particular in the 2015 spending review, where the deepest and most savage austerity cuts took place, the arts were often protected. 250 million Culture Investment Fund in 2019, the Shared Prosperity Fund in 2022, 150 million in Levelling Up for Culture funds in 2022, and of course the 1.8 billion pound Culture Recovery Fund in the pandemic in 2020. Do these things balance out the deep erosion of local government funding, the loss of access to EU funds like Creative Europe, the insufferable tedium of the culture wars, the erosion of the arm's length principle when it comes to ACE? That is a choice that's between each of us and the ballot box. Let's move on to Labour. So this is meant to be Angela Rayner. I asked the same AI to produce Angela Rayner in the same spirit as the Nigel Farage photo. And all I can say is that the Keir Starmer was even worse. So I stopped. Let's get the politics out the way. What if it's Labour? First thing we need to be mindful of is that if it is Labour with a small majority, that government is going to lack stability in exactly the same way that the Conservatives with a small majority lack stability. Labour has the campaign group on the left, the Conservatives have the European Research Group and the Five Families and so on the right. If we have a majority of somewhere between sort of 0 and 30, the likelihood is that we're going to have a government that struggles to maintain discipline. A Labour win doesn't necessarily mean that Thangam Debonair will be Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. So there's been a lot of coverage over the past week or so that she's facing a really strong challenge from the Greens in her constituency. All of the ward councillors in her constituency are Green Party, and the candidate opposing her is Carla Denyer, who featured in the seven-way leaders debate. She was the spokesperson for the Greens. It's also true that governments tend to reshuffle on the way in. So in 1997, Jack Cunningham had been shadow DCMS secretary for 2 years. When Labour won power, Jack Cunningham was packed off to be a junior minister in the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and Chris Smith was made the Secretary of State instead. Barbara Keeley, much liked shadow music and tourism minister, has stepped down, she's gone. But on the other hand, people like Tom Gray, who's a songwriter, he's the chair of the Ivors Academy, the people behind the Ivor Novello Awards. He's standing in Brighton Pavilion, so there's some interesting churn. It's also not clear when we think about the politics whether Labour will be any less prone to constantly switching the Secretary of State for Culture than the Conservatives have been. So this chart's from Wikipedia. So John Major's government, he created DCMS in 1992. It had 4 Secretaries of State for DCMS in 5 years. Labour had 5 Secretaries of State for Culture in 13 years, including the late and spectacularly great Tessa Jowell. With the Conservatives, since 2010, we had Hunt, Miller, Javid, Whittingdale, Bradley, Hancock, Wright, Morgan, Dowden, Dorries, Donlan, Fraser. 12 Secretaries of State for Culture in 14 years. You know this. However, in the same period, Labour have had 1 more shadow Secretary of State for DCMS. They've had 13 in 14 years compared to the Tories' 12. Labour had 6 Metro mayors 3 years ago. Today it's 11. We know that culture-led regeneration of the creative industries have been important to Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham. We know that Tracy Brabin, as an ex-actor, is hugely supportive of culture. Sadiq Khan ran with what he inherited in terms of deputy mayors for culture and the like. Andy Street, I think, was definitely an habitual culture fan. Richard Parker, I don't know at all, but he's making some of the right noises, particularly around arts co-ops, and you'll all know much more than me. But I think this network of metro mayors presents an enormous opportunity, particularly if they start coordinating more and working together. And yes, that's to do with the health and vitality of communities as places, but it is also to do with growth, on which the Labour ship have placed all their hopes for the future. So we know that ACE have been lobbying behind the scenes for more money. They've been talking to Labour. I think the answer is probably going to be A, no, but B, yes, if you help us to grow the economy. If Labour stick to the Conservatives' departmental spending limits, which is what they've said they're going to do, it could be not great news for DCMS. So government controls expenditure using departmental expenditure limits, DELs, and annually managed expenditure, AME. DELs are exactly what they sound like, and each department has a limit it can spend on capital and a limit it can spend on non-capital. Government calls that a resource budget. DCMS actually spends a lot more AME than DEL money, but DELs are pre-planned. They are published as a result of spending reviews and of budgets, and they tend to reveal the government's thinking. So don't treat this with too much weight, because this covers around £2 billion of a DCMS budget that's nearer 8 to 10 billion. But I think the shape of the forecast is helpful to understand the picture. So at the spring budget, DCMS's, the Treasury's Red Book said DCMS's department expenditure limit would drop from 1.8 billion last year to 1.4 billion next year. You can see a fairly clear trend line. So it does look like if Labour do stick to the Conservative spending limits, we can expect DCMS to be squeezed by Labour, although some of the sort of what's called the non-protected departments are expected to be cut by around just 1% next year. It's not going to be slashing, swinging austerity straight away. But certainly increases do seem unlikely. Okay, what have Labour actually said so far? So we are 2 days out from their manifesto launch, so I'm in danger of looking like the biggest fool on Thursday, but here goes. Labour have been briefing that their manifesto is going to be fairly policy light, but what they have told us so far is largely contained in this document, Creating Growth, Labour's Plan for the Arts, Culture and Creative Industry. So already the headline, Creating Growth, is pretty clear. I will pull out some of the headlines. First, space to create. You don't need to read this. It's a pledge in bold to safeguard arts spaces in communities and to use them as hubs of economic growth. Have we mentioned growth yet? Again, you don't need to read this. This is about arts education. The important thing to know here is it's got really warm words, soothing, nice things to hear about arts, sports and drama in education, which we haven't heard from the Conservatives. It goes on to say that the government will undertake a full curriculum review and that it will consult widely across the creative sector. This is a bit of a political classic. The arts are great. We'll do a curriculum review. Leaves you to mentally join the dots to say the curriculum review will benefit arts education, but doesn't actually say that itself anywhere. Music education gets pulled out for specific mention with the promise of the creation of the National Music Education Network. You can see that in bold in the second column. The National Music Education Network is described as a landing point, including a music hub finder tool and providing teaching resources and signposting progression routes. I may be a cynic, but that sounds like a website to me, the National Music Education Network. We will see. But when it comes to talking money, Labour have thrown so much smoke and so many mirrors in the air in this document that I'm tempted to say that almost anything could happen. But here are a few key points. So it says a Labour government would work with the sector, the Creative Industries Council, arts councils and other public funders, investors and donors to create a private finance model or models to attract more funding from different sources into art organisations and put them on a more sustainable footing. We would take a collaborative approach, starting with making grants available to organisations to support them to create business plans and get ready for new kinds of investment. This would include a small amount of government funding alongside private donations. This is all under the heading, a financial model that works. There's a lot of talk of private money. I'm going to read this paragraph really fast. We would then work to make some de-risking capital available to act as a subordinated capital layer and a blended finance structure. Again, the subordinated capital would come from a variety of sources, capitalized by a modest amount of government investment, but including contributions from philanthropists, corporate foundations, social investors, and trusts. Here's the key bit. That money would help to leverage in interest-bearing investment from commercial finance providers such as banks and investment funds. So let's try and turn that into plainer English. A private finance model to attract more funding from different sources, generally business. An expectation of new business models in arts and culture. Some initial investment from a range of sources to reduce the risk to commercial lenders, and then unlocking commercial investment and loans. So I think what they're talking about here is not about regular funding. It's about one-offs. It perhaps doesn't recognise that lots of the national bodies are already carrying really large debts in COVID loans. And if I'm really honest, I also seriously doubt whether a private funding model like this is going to satisfy the high ethical standards of people who work in our sector. This could be really controversial. And while I absolutely see how it might work for someone with, say, the turnover and assets of the Birmingham Royal Ballet, I really struggle with how something like this works for, say, Dudley Little Theatre. This is quite a narrow area of funding, but I really hope that the manifesto later this week will take the opportunity to say more about protecting and growing public funding. I would love to see it, but having listened to lots of interviews with Rachel Reeves, I will be surprised. When Rachel Reeves talks about protecting funding, she talks about education and then health. You'll probably be aware there was a review of Arts Council England underway under Dame Mary Archer. That review was expected to focus on operational efficiency and to largely disappoint those who wanted a bigger conversation. That review has now been paused, and there's a tweet on screen that the wording of which is lifted straight from that Creating Growth document. But note the language around clarifying Arts Council England's purpose. Arts Council England has been given broad priorities and asked to reach into more and more areas. I think it's time to rediscover its core purpose. The new review promises to strengthen the arm's length principle, ask ACE to work with local authorities and mayors to improve local governance standards and decision making. I still can't work out what that means. Simplify and check fairness of grant processes and ensure the needs of organisations of all scales are met. Into the home straight here. So when it comes to retail politics, the kind of the offer to the general public, Labour have said they plan to introduce a law to cap the price of tickets on the secondary market, 10% above their originally sold price. Potentially really significantly, they do appear interested in the high street and town centres, and they plan to replace the business rate system with a new system to level the playing field between the high streets and online giants. That could be, as I say, massively significant sort of footfall rather in town and city centres. But we have to remember the business rate income is split between local government and national government. So actually, depending on how the reform comes, it could further hurt the income going to local government. They have said they're going to offer local government longer term funding settlements, not more money, but more stability over how much money they can expect to have year to year. I wonder whether we're going to hear more about creative enterprise zones on Thursday. Creative enterprise zones offer support to creative businesses, financial incentives, skills development programs, infrastructure improvements. They often offer things like reduced business rates, grants to help creative enterprises thrive. All the parties like them. They featured in the Lib Dem manifesto on Monday. They're in that Labour growth document that we've been quoting from. There are currently 12 creative enterprise zones in London, with 3 more to follow. And there may be here a commitment to roll them out much more broadly, particularly in the Labour mayoralties. Birmingham already has an enterprise zone. It's not a creative enterprise zone. It'll be interesting to see if these roll out, because they will change the priorities of the existing enterprise zones. So to be really reductive about this, just to sort of sum up, in danger of being slightly glib here, but based on what we know so far, it appears that the best way to attract Labour's attention in future as an arts and culture organisation is to provide a valuable community asset in the form of a building, demonstrate a willingness to adopt new business models with less reliance on subsidy where it's currently provided, to spin up some for-profit creative businesses, some startups, perhaps on the high street in a creative enterprise zone, with the support of a Labour mayor or council. That's kind of the sum total of, if you stitch everything together of what we've heard so far, it's kind of where you get. Just a final word on some of the ripples that come out from a general election. It's worth noting that the Lords is going to get bigger. Labour will appoint many peers, and peers can be extremely useful in influencing government. And I think it's also worth just remembering that changes of government tend to create knock-on changes in the leaderships of arm's length bodies and other agencies, directly or indirectly. So we could be in for some dominoes for a time. In terms of what's still to come in the campaign, anything could happen. We had the Lib Dem manifesto yesterday. This is manifesto week. Tuesday, today is the Conservatives, Thursday for Labour. Why are we getting the manifestos this week? Because the first postal votes go out this week. People start voting this week in this election. Another big set piece that we usually get from a new Prime Minister in waiting is their first 100 days speech. What will the first 100 days of a Labour government look like? We've got big interviews, specials, more debates. Might on Thursday or today we see a striking new policy for culture. I'd love to believe it. I think in Labour's case, certainly it's more likely we'll hear some things around education and health. Those are my thoughts. And with that, why don't we open up the floor and hand it over to you and what you've seen and what you've heard and what you